There is a painful truth that few people are willing to admit. The deepest wounds are rarely inflicted by strangers. They are inflicted by those closest to us, the people who know our fears, know our weaknesses, know our insecurities, know exactly where to strike. Family occupies a unique place within the human psyche. Long before friends, long before relationships, long before society, there was family. It was within the family that we first learned love, trust, belonging, acceptance. But it was also within the family that many people first encountered shame, guilt, fear, manipulation, and emotional control. Carl Jung understood that the family is more than a collection of individuals. It is a psychological system, a living structure composed of conscious and unconscious forces. Roles emerge, patterns emerge, expectations emerge, and over time these patterns become invisible, not because they disappear, but because they become normal. The child adapts, the teenager adapts, the adult adapts, until one day they begin asking a dangerous question. Why do I always feel guilty? Why do I constantly seek approval? Why do I feel responsible for everyone else's emotions? Why am I afraid to disappoint people? The answers often lead back to the family, not because every family is toxic, far from it, but because every family possesses unconscious dynamics, and some of those dynamics can become destructive. The most dangerous forms of manipulation are rarely obvious. They do not appear as violence. They do not appear as threats. They do not appear as cruelty. They often appear as love, concern, sacrifice, duty, loyalty, family values. And this is precisely why they are so powerful, because the manipulation becomes difficult to recognize. The individual feels trapped, confused, guilty, unable to explain why something feels wrong. Carl Jung believed that whatever remains unconscious gains power over us, and nowhere is this more evident than within family systems. The manipulations become traditions, the wounds become normal, the dysfunction becomes familiar, and familiarity creates blindness. In this exploration, we will uncover 7 dark psychological tricks that toxic family members often use unconsciously or consciously, not to create hatred, not to create division, but to create awareness, because awareness is the first step toward freedom, the first step toward individuation, the first step toward becoming who you truly are rather than who others expect you to be. And perhaps by the end of this journey, you will begin seeing family dynamics in a completely different light. For the greatest prison is not the one built around the body, it is the one built around the mind, and some of those prisons are inherited long before we realize they exist. Trick number 1. Guilt as a weapon. How toxic family members make you feel responsible for their happiness. There is a form of control so subtle that many people spend decades under its influence without ever recognizing it. It does not require threats, it does not require violence, it does not require shouting. In fact, it often disguises itself as love, duty, respect, family loyalty. And because it wears these masks, it becomes extraordinarily difficult to identify. Carl Jung understood that the most powerful psychological forces are often the ones operating beneath conscious awareness. The unconscious does not announce itself. It whispers, it influences, it guides behavior from the shadows, and guilt is one of its favorite tools. Most people think guilt is always negative. Jung would disagree. Healthy guilt serves an important purpose. It helps individuals recognize when they have violated their own values. It encourages responsibility. It encourages moral growth. It encourages self-reflection. Healthy guilt can strengthen character. But toxic guilt is something entirely different. Toxic guilt is not designed to promote growth. It is designed to maintain control. And within dysfunctional family systems, it often becomes one of the most effective forms of manipulation. The process usually begins early. A child learns that the emotional atmosphere of the household matters. Parents are stressed, angry, disappointed, overwhelmed. The child notices these emotions, and because children are naturally dependent upon caregivers, they begin adapting, trying to help, trying to please, trying to reduce tension, trying to restore harmony. At first this seems harmless, even admirable, but over time something dangerous can occur. The child begins assuming responsibility for emotions that were never theirs to carry. The unconscious belief forms, it is my job to keep everyone happy. It is my responsibility to prevent conflict. If someone is upset, I must fix it. If someone suffers, I am somehow to blame. These beliefs often survive long into adulthood. The child grows older, the psychological pattern remains. Now imagine a toxic family member interacting with such a person. Consciously or unconsciously, they discover a powerful lever: guilt. Whenever they do not get what they want, guilt appears. Whenever boundaries are established, guilt appears. Whenever independence emerges, guilt appears. The individual attempts to make a decision. Suddenly they hear, "After everything we've done for you, I guess family doesn't matter anymore. We sacrificed so much for you. You're breaking your mother's heart. You only think about yourself." Notice something interesting. The conversation is no longer about the decision itself. The conversation becomes emotional. The goal is not understanding. The goal is pressure, because guilt creates pressure, and pressure influences behavior. Carl Jung believed that unconscious complexes possess extraordinary power. A complex is a cluster of emotionally charged ideas buried within the psyche. Once activated, it can temporarily override rational thinking. Family guilt frequently functions like a complex. A simple disagreement activates deep emotional memories. The adult suddenly feels like a child again. Anxiety appears, fear appears, obligation appears. The individual feels compelled to comply, not because the request is reasonable, but because the guilt feels overwhelming. This is why toxic guilt is so effective. It bypasses logic, it targets identity. The person is no longer asking, "Is this request fair?" Instead, they are asking, "Am I a bad son? Am I a bad daughter? Am I selfish? Am I ungrateful?" The manipulation shifts attention away from behavior and towards self-worth. And once self-worth becomes involved, objectivity becomes difficult. Jung would likely recognize another dynamic operating here: projection. Many toxic family members cannot tolerate their own guilt, their own fears, their own insecurities. As a result, they unconsciously project these emotions onto others. Instead of confronting their loneliness, they make someone else responsible for it. Instead of confronting their disappointment, they make someone else responsible for it. Instead of confronting their unhappiness, they make someone else responsible for it. The burden shifts, the responsibility shifts, and the target begins carrying emotional weight that never belonged to them. This creates an exhausting existence. The individual constantly monitors other people's emotions, constantly anticipates reactions, constantly avoids conflict, constantly sacrifices personal needs, not because they want to, but because guilt has become deeply ingrained. Carl Jung warned repeatedly about unconscious identification with roles. Family systems often assign roles without anyone realizing it. The caretaker, the peacemaker, the responsible one, the successful one, the scapegoat, the rebel. The problem is that roles eventually become prisons. The individual forgets who they are outside the role. They become trapped inside expectations, and expectations become obligations. Imagine someone who has spent 30 years being the caretaker. The moment they establish a boundary, family members react, not because the boundary is unreasonable, but because the role has changed. The system feels threatened. The family unconsciously attempts to restore equilibrium, and guilt becomes the preferred weapon. Because guilt is efficient, it creates compliance without force. The individual polices themselves. The prison guard becomes internal. This is why guilt can be more powerful than direct control. Direct control creates resistance. Guilt creates self-control. The individual becomes both prisoner and jailer. Jung believed true psychological development requires individuation, the process of becoming an authentic individual, not merely a collection of expectations imposed by others. This process inevitably creates tension, because individuation requires separation, not necessarily physical separation, but psychological separation, the ability to recognize where another person's responsibility ends and yours begins. This sounds simple. Yet for many people it is extraordinarily difficult, because guilt blurs boundaries. The individual feels responsible for everyone, everyone's happiness, everyone's comfort, everyone's expectations, everyone's approval. The result is chronic emotional exhaustion. No matter how much they give, it never feels enough. Because the problem was never a lack of giving. The problem was the illusion of responsibility. You cannot manage another person's emotions for them. You cannot live their life for them. You cannot solve every disappointment they experience. You cannot carry every burden they refuse to carry themselves, and attempting to do so destroys your own psychological development. This realization often feels uncomfortable. even frightening. The individual worries, if I stop carrying this responsibility, am I becoming selfish? Jung would ask a different question. Who taught you that self-sacrifice and self-abandonment are the same thing? Because they are not. Compassion is healthy, self-abandonment is not. Kindness is healthy, psychological slavery is not. Support is healthy, carrying everyone's emotional world is not. The individuated person learns something profound. Love does not require surrendering oneself. Love does not require permanent guilt. Love does not require constant self-betrayal. Authentic love respects boundaries. Authentic love respects individuality. Authentic love allows freedom. Toxic guilt allows none of these things. Toxic guilt demands, pressures, manipulates, controls, and then disguises itself as concern. This is what makes it so difficult to identify, because the words often sound loving, yet the emotional effect feels suffocating. The individual feels trapped, obligated, responsible for things no human being could reasonably control. This is the first dark psychological trick toxic family members use. They convince you that their happiness is your responsibility. Their emotions become your burden. Their expectations become your duty. Their disappointments become your fault. And if this belief remains unconscious, it can control an entire lifetime. But the moment awareness emerges, something changes. The individual begins recognizing the pattern, recognizing the manipulation, recognizing the false responsibility, and awareness creates freedom. Not freedom from caring, but freedom from carrying burdens that never belong to you. Because one of the most important lessons Jung ever taught was this: you cannot become yourself while living entirely for the expectations of others. And the journey toward becoming yourself often begins with a simple realization: not every guilt you feel actually belongs to you. Trick number 2, the scapegoat trap. How toxic families make one person carry everyone else's shadow. There is a disturbing pattern that appears in dysfunctional families across cultures, generations, and social classes. A pattern so common that Carl Jung would have immediately recognized it. One person becomes the problem. One person becomes the disappointment. One person becomes the source of conflict. One person becomes the family scapegoat. And once this role is assigned, reality often stops mattering because the scapegoat is no longer treated as an individual. They become a symbol, a container, a psychological dumping ground for everything the family refuses to confront within itself. To understand this phenomenon, we must first understand one of Jung's most important concepts: the shadow. The shadow contains everything we reject about ourselves: weakness, aggression, jealousy, resentment, selfishness, fear, insecurity, shame, the parts of ourselves that threaten the image we wish to maintain. Most people do not consciously acknowledge these qualities. Instead, they project them outward. They see them in other people, condemn them in other people, attack them in other people, and this is where the scapegoat enters the story, because families often operate according to unconscious psychological rules. Every family develops a shared identity, a shared image, a story about who they are, and every story contains contradictions. Every family contains conflict. Every family contains wounds. Every family contains dysfunction. The question is, who will carry it? Healthy families distribute responsibility honestly. Toxic families often do something else. They unconsciously assign one person the role of carrying the family's shadow. The scapegoat becomes the embodiment of everything the family refuses to face. If the family is angry, the scapegoat becomes the angry one. If the family is dysfunctional, the scapegoat becomes the problem. If the family is emotionally immature, the scapegoat becomes the difficult one. The projection begins. And once projection begins, reality becomes distorted. The scapegoat may tell the truth. They may identify problems. They may challenge unhealthy patterns. Yet their words are dismissed automatically, not because they are wrong, but because their role has already been assigned. The family no longer sees the person, they see the role. This is what makes scapegoating so psychologically devastating. The individual begins questioning themselves, questioning their perceptions, questioning their memories, questioning their reality. Everyone else appears united, everyone else seems to agree. The scapegoat stands alone, and standing alone is terrifying. Carl Jung observed that human beings possess a powerful need for belonging. To be excluded from the group activates deep psychological fears, ancient fears, evolutionary fears, the fear of isolation, the fear of abandonment, the fear of rejection. Toxic family systems exploit these fears, sometimes consciously, often unconsciously. The message becomes clear: agree with us or become the problem. Stay silent or become the problem. Accept the dysfunction or become the problem. The scapegoat faces an impossible choice: remain authentic and risk rejection, or abandon authenticity and maintain acceptance. Many spend years choosing acceptance, suppressing thoughts, suppressing feelings, suppressing truth, trying desperately to earn approval, trying desperately to prove they are not the problem. But there is a tragic reality hidden within this effort. The scapegoat can never fully succeed because the role was never based on behavior. It was based on projection, and projections do not disappear through compliance. Imagine a family unwilling to acknowledge its own anger, its own resentment, its own dysfunction. Those emotions must go somewhere. Psychologically speaking, the shadow demands expression. The family unconsciously chooses a target. The scapegoat absorbs the projection. Suddenly they become responsible for emotional tensions that existed long before they arrived. They become blamed for problems they did not create, criticized for issues they did not cause, punished for truths nobody wants to hear. Jung would have recognized this process immediately, because projection always seeks a host. The unconscious refuses responsibility, so it creates an enemy. And within families, that enemy is often one of their own. This explains why scapegoats are frequently the truth tellers, the most emotionally aware, the most independent, the most sensitive to dysfunction. They notice what others ignore, they question what others accept, they challenge what others fear. And because of this, they become threatening, not because they are dangerous, but because awareness is dangerous to unconscious systems. The truth destabilizes denial, reality destabilizes illusion, and toxic systems depend upon illusion. The illusion that everything is fine, the illusion that nothing is wrong, the illusion that the family is healthy. The scapegoat threatens these illusions merely by existing. Now, something fascinating begins to happen. Many scapegoats eventually internalize the role. After years of criticism, they begin believing it. They assume they are flawed, broken, defective. The family narrative becomes their identity, and this is where the deepest damage occurs. Because the prison moves inside the mind, the individual becomes their own critic, their own accuser, their own persecutor. Even after leaving the family environment, the voices remain, the shame remains, the self-doubt remains. Jung believed individuation requires confronting exactly this kind of psychological conditioning. The individual must separate reality from projection, must distinguish truth from inherited narratives, must ask difficult questions. Am I actually the problem, or am I carrying a role assigned to me? Whose voice am I hearing inside my head? Whose judgment am I still obeying? These questions can be transformative because they begin dismantling the false identity. The scapegoat slowly realizes something shocking. The family's perception was not necessarily reality. The accusations were not necessarily truth. The role was not necessarily deserved. And once this realization appears, healing begins. Not immediately, not easily, but inevitably, because awareness changes everything. The individual stops viewing themselves through the eyes of the system, stops defining themselves through projections, stops carrying burdens that never belonged to them. This does not mean anger disappears overnight, or pain, or grief. Years of scapegoating leave deep psychological scars, but awareness creates a new possibility: freedom. The freedom to define oneself, the freedom to reject false identities, the freedom to step outside the role entirely. Carl Jung believed that psychological growth often requires separation from collective expectations. The scapegoat's journey embodies this truth perfectly. To heal, they must stop seeking validation from the system that wounded them. They must stop proving their innocence, stop chasing approval, stop fighting for a role they never chose. Instead, they must begin the difficult process of becoming themselves. And this is the second dark psychological trick toxic family members use. They unconsciously make one person carry the family's shadow. One person becomes responsible for everyone's discomfort, everyone's denial, everyone's unresolved pain. But the moment the scapegoat recognizes the role, the illusion begins to crack, because the greatest power toxic systems possess is unconsciousness. And the moment consciousness arrives, the system can no longer hide behind the lie. The scapegoat was never the problem. They were simply the mirror reflecting what nobody else wanted to see. Trick number 3, conditional love. How toxic family members train you to earn love instead of receiving it. There is a question that many people never think to ask. a question so fundamental that it quietly shapes their entire lives. The question is, do I believe I am lovable simply because I exist? Or do I believe love must be earned, must be deserved, must be purchased through sacrifice, obedience, achievement, and self-abandonment? For many people raised in toxic family systems, the answer is painful, because somewhere deep within the unconscious mind, they learned a dangerous lesson. Love is not freely given. Love must be earned. Carl Jung understood that childhood experiences do not simply disappear, they become psychological structures, invisible frameworks through which we interpret reality. The child who repeatedly receives conditional affection begins forming unconscious beliefs, beliefs about love, beliefs about worth, beliefs about identity, and these beliefs often remain active for decades. Imagine a child receiving affection only when they perform correctly, only when they obey, only when they achieve, only when they meet expectations, only when they make others happy. The message may never be spoken directly, yet the unconscious receives it clearly. When I succeed, I am loved. When I disappoint, I am rejected. When I serve others, I matter. When I express myself, I become a problem. Slowly, love transforms into a transaction, and transactions create anxiety, because transactions can always fail. The child learns to monitor behavior constantly, to anticipate expectations, to suppress authenticity, to become whatever others require, not because they are manipulative, but because survival depends upon connection. Every child needs love. Every child needs acceptance. Every child needs belonging. When these needs become conditional, adaptation becomes necessary. Carl Jung believed that adaptation often creates the persona, the social mask, the version of ourselves designed to gain approval. The persona is not inherently unhealthy. Everyone needs a social identity. The problem begins when the persona becomes more important than the self, when the mask replaces authenticity, when approval replaces identity, when acceptance becomes more valuable than truth. This is where conditional love becomes psychologically destructive. The individual stops asking, "Who am I?" and begins asking, "Who do I need to become in order to be loved?" The difference is enormous. One question leads toward individuation. The other leads toward self-abandonment. Many toxic family systems reinforce this dynamic unconsciously. Affection becomes unpredictable. Approval becomes inconsistent. Validation becomes conditional. One day the child is praised, the next day criticized, one day accepted, the next day rejected. The rules constantly change, and uncertainty creates dependency. The child becomes hypervigilant, constantly scanning emotional environments, constantly monitoring reactions, constantly trying to avoid mistakes, because mistakes feel dangerous, mistakes threaten connection, and connection feels essential for survival. Years later, the child becomes an adult, yet the pattern remains. They become people pleasers, perfectionists, approval seekers, caretakers, not because these roles reflect who they truly are, but because these roles once provided safety. The unconscious continues repeating what once worked, even when it no longer serves them. Carl Jung observed that unconscious patterns seek repetition. The psyche recreates familiar experiences, not because they are healthy, but because they are familiar. This explains why many individuals raised with conditional love find themselves attracted to similar relationships later in life. Partners who withhold affection, friends who demand constant sacrifice, employers who exploit loyalty, authority figures who make approval feel scarce. The emotional environment feels strangely familiar, painful, yet familiar, and familiarity often disguises itself as comfort. The individual mistakes the pattern for love, because the pattern is all they know. This is one of the cruelest consequences of conditional love. It distorts perception. The person begins believing that anxiety is intimacy, that earning affection is normal, that self-sacrifice is necessary, that exhaustion is proof of love. But authentic love operates differently. Authentic love does not require self-erasure. Authentic love does not require constant performance. Authentic love does not disappear whenever expectations remain unmet. Jung believed that individuation requires confronting these inherited beliefs. The individual must ask uncomfortable questions. What if I am worthy without proving it? What if my value exists independently of achievement? What if love is not something I earn? For many people, these questions feel revolutionary because they challenge decades of conditioning reinforced by family, reinforced by relationships, reinforced by society. The mind resists. Fear emerges, guilt emerges, anxiety emerges because authenticity threatens the old system. The individual begins setting boundaries. The family reacts. The individual begins expressing needs. The family reacts. The individual begins prioritizing personal growth. The family reacts. Why? Because toxic systems depend upon predictability. The role must remain stable. The caretaker must continue caring. The peacemaker must continue sacrificing. The achiever must continue performing. The obedient child must continue obeying. The moment someone steps outside the role, the system experiences discomfort, and discomfort creates resistance. Carl Jung would likely recognize this as a defense mechanism. The family unconsciously attempts to preserve equilibrium, not because everyone is evil, but because change feels threatening, especially when unconscious dynamics are involved. The individual pursuing authenticity disrupts the familiar pattern. Suddenly, the family must confront realities previously ignored. Boundaries appear, expectations are questioned, roles begin collapsing, and toxic systems often interpret healthy change as betrayal. This is where conditional love becomes visible. The affection that once seemed unconditional begins disappearing. Approval becomes withdrawal. Support becomes criticism. Understanding becomes guilt. The individual finally sees what was previously hidden. The love was attached to compliance. The acceptance was attached to performance. The connection was attached to obedience. Reality emerges. And reality can be painful. Yet reality is also liberating, because truth creates freedom. The individual realizes something profound. They were never loved for who they were. They were often loved for the role they played. And once this realization occurs, healing begins. Not immediately, not easily, but inevitably. The person begins separating identity from performance, worth from achievement, love from approval, connection from self-sacrifice. This process is difficult because it requires grieving. Grieving the love that should have existed. Grieving the acceptance that should have existed, grieving the childhood that should have existed. Jung understood that psychological growth often involves grief, the death of illusions, the death of false identities, the death of inherited beliefs. Only then can something authentic emerge, the authentic self, the person beneath the roles, beneath the masks, beneath the expectations. The individual finally discovers something remarkable. They no longer need to earn their existence. They no longer need to justify their worth. They no longer need to become someone else in order to deserve love. Because worth was never something that needed to be earned. It was always there, hidden beneath years of conditioning, hidden beneath years of performance, hidden beneath years of fear. This is the third dark psychological trick toxic family members use. They teach you that love must be earned, that acceptance must be purchased, that worth depends upon obedience. And if this lesson remains unconscious, it can shape an entire lifetime. But the moment awareness arrives, the illusion begins to collapse. Because authentic love is not a reward for perfection. Authentic love is the recognition of humanity. And the journey towards psychological freedom begins the moment you stop performing for affection and start accepting yourself as you are. Trick number 4, gaslighting. How toxic family members make you doubt your own reality. There is a form of manipulation so psychologically destructive that it can make intelligent people question their own sanity, not because they are weak, not because they are irrational, but because the manipulation attacks something fundamental. Their perception of reality. Carl Jung believed that consciousness depends upon our ability to distinguish what is real from what is imagined, what happened from what did not happen, what belongs to us from what belongs to others. Gaslighting attacks this ability directly, and within toxic family systems, it often becomes one of the most powerful methods of control. Unlike obvious manipulation, gaslighting rarely appears aggressive. It often appears calm, reasonable, even loving. This is precisely why it is effective. The goal is not to win an argument. The goal is to create confusion. Because confused people are easier to control. A person who trusts their perception becomes difficult to manipulate. A person who doubts their perception becomes dependent upon external validation, and dependency creates power. Imagine a child expressing pain. Perhaps a parent says something hurtful. Perhaps a sibling humiliates them. Perhaps an emotionally damaging event occurs. The child responds honestly, "That hurt me." Instead of acknowledging the experience, the family responds, "You're too sensitive. That never happened. You're exaggerating." You're imagining things. You're remembering it wrong. At first, these statements seem insignificant, yet repeated over years, they create profound psychological consequences because the child receives two conflicting messages. The first message comes from experience. Something feels wrong. The second message comes from authority. Nothing is wrong. The child faces an impossible dilemma: trust personal perception or trust the family. Most children choose the family, not because the family is correct, but because survival depends upon attachment. The mind adapts, and adaptation often requires self-betrayal. Gradually, the child learns to distrust themselves. Their emotions become suspect, their memories become suspect, their instincts become suspect, their reality becomes suspect. Carl Jung understood that whatever is repeatedly denied by consciousness often retreats into the unconscious. The child stops expressing feelings, stops trusting intuition, stops speaking honestly. The psyche fragments. Part of the individual experiences reality. Another part denies reality. This creates inner conflict, and inner conflict becomes fertile ground for manipulation. Years later, the child becomes an adult, yet the pattern remains. Whenever conflict arises, they immediately doubt themselves. Whenever someone challenges them, they question their memory. Whenever discomfort appears, they assume they are the problem. Not because reality supports these conclusions, but because gaslighting trained them to distrust themselves. This is one reason toxic family systems remain stable for so long. The individual no longer needs external control. The doubt has become internal. The manipulator's voice now exists inside the victim's mind, and internalized control is often stronger than external control. Jung would likely recognize this as a psychological complex, a cluster of emotionally charged beliefs operating outside awareness. The individual encounters conflict. The complex activates. Self-doubt appears automatically. Anxiety appears automatically. Confusion appears automatically. The reaction feels natural, yet it is actually conditioned. The person is responding to old programming rather than present reality. This explains why many individuals raised in toxic families struggle with decision-making. Every choice feels overwhelming. Every disagreement feels dangerous. Every boundary feels selfish, because they have spent years being taught that their perceptions cannot be trusted. Now consider something even more disturbing. Gaslighting often occurs unconsciously. Many toxic family members genuinely believe their version of events. Why? Because acknowledging reality would require confronting their shadow, their mistakes, their failures, their harmful behavior, their guilt, and confronting the shadow is uncomfortable. The unconscious prefers defense. Denial becomes easier. Projection becomes easier. Distortion becomes easier. Reality becomes negotiable. The family member rewrites history, not necessarily because they are calculating, but because the truth threatens their self-image. Jung repeatedly warned that whatever remains unconscious influences behavior in powerful ways. A person unwilling to face their shadow often distorts reality to protect themselves, and anyone challenging that distortion becomes a threat. This creates a toxic cycle. The truth teller becomes the problem. The person describing reality becomes the troublemaker. The one pointing out dysfunction becomes accused of creating dysfunction. The family narrative must remain intact, even if reality must be sacrificed. This is why gaslighting can feel so disorienting. The individual knows something happened, remembers something happened, feels something happened, yet everyone around them insists otherwise. The social pressure becomes immense. Human beings naturally seek consensus. We feel safer when others agree with us. Gaslighting weaponizes this instinct. The manipulator creates isolation. The target begins feeling alone, and loneliness weakens confidence. The person gradually becomes dependent upon external confirmation. Am I remembering correctly? Am I overreacting? Am I imagining things? Notice what has happened. The focus shifts away from the behavior. The focus shifts toward the victim's perception, and once perception becomes the issue, the manipulator gains enormous advantage. The conversation is no longer about reality. It is about whether reality exists at all. This is the true danger of gaslighting. It does not merely distort events, it distorts identity. The individual loses trust in themselves, and self-trust is one of the foundations of psychological health. Jung believed individuation requires developing a strong relationship with one's inner experience, thoughts, feelings, dreams, intuition, perception. The individuated person learns to listen inward, Gaslighting teaches the opposite. Ignore yourself, trust others, question your instincts, doubt your memories, suppress your perceptions. The result is profound disconnection from the self. Healing begins when this disconnection is recognized. The individual starts noticing patterns, starts recognizing manipulation, starts validating personal experiences, not blindly, not arrogantly, but honestly. A simple realization emerges. Just because someone disagrees with my reality does not mean my reality is false. This realization can feel revolutionary, especially for those raised in environments where reality was constantly denied. The person begins rebuilding trust, trust in emotions, trust in memory, trust in perception, trust in intuition. Slowly, the internalized doubt weakens. The voice of the manipulator loses power. The authentic self becomes stronger. Carl Jung understood that consciousness always threatens unconscious systems because awareness exposes what denial conceals, and gaslighting depends entirely upon denial. The moment awareness appears, the manipulation begins losing effectiveness. The individual stops asking, "Am I crazy?" and begins asking, "Why am I being encouraged to doubt myself?" This question changes everything because it redirects attention toward the manipulation itself, toward the pattern, toward reality. And reality possesses extraordinary power. Reality does not require defense. Reality simply exists. This is the fourth dark psychological trick toxic family members use. They make you question your own mind, your memories, your emotions, your perceptions, your reality, because a person who trusts themselves becomes difficult to control. But the moment awareness returns, the illusion begins collapsing, and once you learn to trust your own experience again, the manipulator loses one of their most powerful weapons. Because psychological freedom begins the moment you stop asking others to confirm every truth you already know. Trick number 5, emotional blackmail. How toxic family members use fear, obligation, and duty to control your life. There is a form of manipulation that rarely looks like manipulation. It does not arrive wearing the face of aggression. It does not announce itself as control. It rarely says, "You must obey me." Instead, it appears disguised as concern, as sacrifice, as family loyalty, as responsibility, as duty. And because these values are often respected, the manipulation becomes difficult to recognize. Carl Jung understood that the most powerful forms of control are frequently unconscious. The individual believes they are acting freely, yet beneath the surface, invisible psychological forces are guiding their decisions. Emotional blackmail operates precisely this way. It does not control behavior through force. It controls behavior through emotion, specifically fear, obligation, and guilt. These three emotions form one of the strongest psychological chains a human being can experience, because unlike physical chains, emotional chains are carried inside the mind, and what is carried inside often feels natural. The individual does not realize they are being controlled. They simply believe they are being a good son, a good daughter, a good sibling, a good family member, until one day they begin noticing something strange. Every important decision seems to produce guilt. Every boundary creates conflict. Every act of independence feels selfish. Every attempt at self-development feels like betrayal. And suddenly, an uncomfortable question appears. Why do I feel guilty every time I choose myself? The answer often lies in emotional blackmail. The process usually begins early. The child learns that family harmony depends upon compliance. When they obey, things remain calm. When they disagree, tension appears. When they assert themselves, disappointment appears. When they pursue independence, emotional pressure appears. The lesson becomes unconscious. My freedom hurts people. My individuality hurts people. My growth hurts people. Over time, the child learns to suppress personal needs, not because they lack desires, but because satisfying those desires feels dangerous. Carl Jung believed that repeated emotional experiences eventually become psychological structures. The mind creates internal rules, rules that operate automatically, rules that no longer require conscious thought. And one of the most common rules created by emotional blackmail is this: I am responsible for other people's emotional comfort. Once this belief exists, manipulation becomes remarkably easy. A toxic family member does not need to demand obedience directly. They merely need to display disappointment, sadness, silence, victimhood, suffering. The conditioned individual immediately feels responsible, and responsibility creates compliance. This is why emotional blackmail often appears subtle. A parent may say, "Do whatever you want," yet their tone communicates something entirely different. The words grant freedom, the emotion punishes it. The message becomes, "You are free to choose, but if you choose yourself, you will hurt me." This creates a psychological trap. The individual technically has freedom, yet emotionally they do not, because every choice carries guilt. Every act of autonomy feels cruel. Every act of self-respect feels selfish. Jung would likely recognize another force operating beneath this dynamic: the shadow. Many emotionally manipulative family members struggle to take responsibility for their own emotional lives, their loneliness, their fears, their disappointments, their unmet needs. Instead of confronting these emotions directly, they unconsciously transfer responsibility onto others. The burden shifts. The child becomes responsible. The sibling becomes responsible. The family member becomes responsible. Anyone except the person who actually owns the emotion. This is what makes emotional blackmail so damaging. It reverses psychological responsibility. The individual begins carrying burdens that never belong to them. And because these burdens are impossible to carry successfully, chronic anxiety develops. No matter how much they sacrifice, it never feels enough. No matter how much they give, someone remains disappointed. No matter how much they comply, another expectation appears. The finish line keeps moving. Because the goal was never resolution. The goal was control. Not necessarily conscious control, but control nonetheless. Jung understood that individuation requires separating oneself from collective expectations. The individual must eventually distinguish between genuine responsibility and false responsibility. This distinction is crucial. You are responsible for your actions, but not for another person's happiness. You are responsible for your choices, but not for another person's emotional reactions. You are responsible for your behavior, but not for another person's inability to manage their emotions. For many people raised in toxic families, this realization feels shocking because they have spent years believing the opposite. Years believing that peace depends upon compliance. Years believing that love depends upon sacrifice, years believing that duty requires self-abandonment. Yet, authentic love does not require self-abandonment. Authentic love respects individuality. Authentic love respects freedom. Authentic love allows disagreement. Toxic control does not. The moment someone begins individuating, the family system often reacts, not because individuation is wrong, but because change disrupts familiar patterns. The person who always said yes begins saying no. The person who always sacrificed begins establishing boundaries. The person who always carried everyone else's emotions begins returning responsibility where it belongs. And suddenly, the system experiences discomfort. Emotional blackmail intensifies. More guilt, more obligation, more pressure. Why? Because unhealthy systems fight to preserve themselves. Jung would argue that unconscious systems resist awareness. Awareness threatens old patterns. Awareness threatens control. Awareness threatens dependency. And emotional blackmail depends upon all three. This is why boundaries often feel terrifying at first. The individual expects rejection, conflict, disappointment. The old conditioning activates. The fear appears. Yet every healthy boundary strengthens something important: self-respect. And self-respect is essential for individuation. Because the person who cannot say no eventually loses the ability to say yes authentically. Every choice becomes obligation. Every relationship becomes duty. Every act of kindness becomes compulsion. The soul slowly disappears beneath responsibility. Jung believed the purpose of life was not endless obedience. It was becoming oneself, becoming conscious, becoming whole. And wholeness requires freedom. Freedom to choose. Freedom to disagree. Freedom to grow. Freedom to disappoint people when necessary. This does not mean becoming cruel. It does not mean becoming selfish. It means accepting a difficult truth. Some people will be disappointed by your growth. Some people benefited from your lack of boundaries. Some people were comfortable with the version of you that abandoned itself. And when you change, they may resist, not because you are wrong, but because the old arrangement no longer serves them. This is the fifth dark psychological trick toxic family members use. They convince you that love requires obligation, that loyalty requires self-sacrifice, that family requires emotional servitude. And if this belief remains unconscious, it can shape every major decision of your life. But the moment awareness appears, something changes. The chain becomes visible, and once a chain becomes visible, it can finally be broken. Because genuine love invites freedom. Only control demands captivity. Trick number 6, triangulation. How toxic family members turn relatives against each other to maintain control. There is a reason healthy relationships value direct communication, because truth moves in a straight line. One person speaks, another person listens. Misunderstandings are addressed openly. Problems are confronted honestly. Reality remains relatively clear. Toxic family systems often operate differently. Reality becomes indirect. Messages travel through intermediaries. Opinions become distorted. Conflicts become hidden. And slowly, family members stop communicating with each other and begin communicating about each other. Carl Jung would have recognized this phenomenon immediately, not merely as a communication problem, but as a psychological defense mechanism, a way of avoiding truth, avoiding confrontation, avoiding responsibility. This process is known as triangulation, and it is one of the most effective manipulation strategies found within dysfunctional families. Unlike obvious control tactics, triangulation often appears harmless. In fact, it may initially seem like concern. A parent shares information about one sibling with another. A relative quietly reports private conversations. Someone claims they are simply trying to keep the peace. Yet beneath the surface, something far more complicated is occurring. Information is being managed, relationships are being influenced, perceptions are being shaped, and power is being concentrated. To understand triangulation, imagine 3 people. Person A has a problem with person B. In a healthy system, person A speaks directly to person B. The issue is addressed openly. In a toxic system, person A avoids direct communication. Instead, they speak to person C. Now person C becomes involved. Opinions form, alliances form, stories evolve. The original conflict grows larger, and soon the relationship itself becomes contaminated by second-hand narratives. The result is confusion, because nobody is interacting with reality directly. Everyone is interacting with interpretations, and interpretations are easily manipulated. Jung believed that unconscious systems often survive through distortion. Truth threatens unhealthy dynamics. Clarity threatens control. Direct communication threatens hidden agendas. Triangulation protects all 3. The manipulative family member becomes the center of information, the center of influence, the center of emotional gravity. Everyone begins relying upon them to understand everyone else, and this dependency creates power, because whoever controls the narrative often controls perception. Now consider the psychological effects of this pattern. Imagine growing up in a family where people rarely speak honestly to one another. Instead, messages travel indirectly. Criticism arrives through third parties. Opinions arrive through rumors. Conflict remains hidden beneath politeness. Over time, trust begins deteriorating. Family members become suspicious, defensive, guarded. No one knows what is being said behind closed doors. No one knows which version of events is accurate. The atmosphere becomes psychologically unstable, and instability creates dependency. People begin looking toward the manipulator for guidance, for clarification, for interpretation. The manipulator becomes indispensable. This is not accidental. Whether conscious or unconscious, triangulation often serves a psychological purpose: control. Carl Jung observed that many individuals fear direct confrontation because confrontation threatens the persona, the carefully constructed image they present to the world. If they communicate honestly, conflict may occur, disapproval may occur, accountability may occur, so they avoid directness. Instead, they recruit others, creating triangles, creating alliances, creating emotional coalitions. The conflict remains hidden, yet its influence spreads everywhere. One of the darkest aspects of triangulation is how effectively it divides people. Two family members who could have healthy relationships become suspicious of one another. Misunderstandings multiply, resentments grow, distance increases, and often neither person understands why. The relationship slowly deteriorates without any direct cause, because the manipulation occurred indirectly, through suggestion, through implication, through carefully managed information. Jung would likely describe this as a manifestation of the shadow. The manipulator refuses to confront their own fears, their own insecurities, their own conflicts. Instead, these conflicts are externalized, projected into relationships. The family becomes a battlefield for emotions the individual refuses to acknowledge consciously, and everyone becomes affected. Now imagine being raised inside such a system. Eventually, triangulation begins feeling normal. Direct communication feels uncomfortable. Honesty feels risky. Transparency feels dangerous. The individual learns to navigate relationships through assumptions rather than conversations, through rumors rather than truth, through emotional politics rather than authenticity. The consequences can last decades. Many adults from toxic family systems discover that they struggle with trust, struggle with communication, struggle with confrontation, not because they are incapable, but because they were never taught healthy alternatives. The family normalized triangulation, and what becomes normal often becomes invisible. This is why awareness is so important. The first step toward breaking triangulation is recognizing it. Recognizing when someone attempts to involve you in conflicts that do not belong to you. Recognizing when information is being used to manipulate perception. Recognizing when you are being encouraged to choose sides instead of seek truth. Carl Jung believed that individuation requires courage. The courage to leave unconscious systems behind. The courage to speak directly. The courage to seek reality rather than narratives. This courage often feels uncomfortable initially, because unhealthy systems punish authenticity. The person who refuses triangulation threatens the entire structure. Imagine responding differently. Instead of accepting gossip, you encourage direct communication. Instead of choosing sides, you seek understanding. Instead of participating in emotional alliances, you maintain neutrality. Suddenly, the manipulative dynamic loses power, because triangulation depends upon participation. Without participants, the triangle collapses. This is why healthy boundaries are so disruptive to toxic systems. Boundaries expose manipulation. Boundaries reduce confusion. Boundaries restore clarity, and clarity threatens anyone benefiting from distortion. Many toxic family members become frustrated when triangulation stops working, because they lose influence, lose control, lose access to the emotional leverage they once possessed. The family begins relating directly, and direct relationships are much harder to manipulate. This is precisely why healthy communication feels revolutionary in dysfunctional environments. Truth begins replacing narratives. Reality begins replacing assumptions. Authenticity begins replacing politics. The entire system changes. Carl Jung believed that consciousness always dissolves illusions, and triangulation survives through illusion. The illusion that people cannot communicate directly. The illusion that misunderstanding is inevitable. The illusion that conflict requires intermediaries. Awareness exposes these illusions, and once exposed, they begin losing power. This is the sixth dark psychological trick toxic family members use. They turn relatives against each other, not always through lies, sometimes simply through selective truths, selective information, selective narratives, carefully managed perceptions. The goal is rarely resolution, the goal is influence. But the moment awareness emerges, something changes. The individual stops participating in triangles, stops carrying messages, stops choosing sides automatically, stops accepting narratives without verification, and in doing so, they reclaim something invaluable: a direct relationship with reality. Because truth travels in straight lines, only manipulation requires triangles. Trick number 7. The fear of abandonment. How toxic family systems make you afraid to become yourself. There is one manipulation more powerful than guilt, more powerful than gaslighting, more powerful than emotional blackmail. Because unlike the others, it does not merely influence behavior, it shapes identity. It shapes the very person you believe yourself to be. Carl Jung understood that every human being faces a fundamental psychological challenge, the challenge of becoming themselves, not the self others expect, not the self society rewards, not the self designed to gain approval, but the authentic self hidden beneath conditioning, expectations, and fear. This process is what Jung called individuation, and according to Jung, it is one of the most important journeys a human being can undertake. Yet toxic family systems often fear individuation, not consciously, not deliberately, but psychologically, because individuation changes the system. The child begins thinking independently, the adult begins questioning old rules, the family member begins creating boundaries, the familiar roles begin dissolving, and whenever a system depends upon control, independence becomes threatening. This is where the fear of abandonment enters. The manipulation is rarely spoken directly. No one says, "Do not become yourself." Instead, the message appears indirectly, through guilt, through criticism, through rejection, through withdrawal of affection, through subtle emotional consequences. The individual learns an unconscious lesson. If I become myself, I may lose love. If I disagree, I may lose belonging. If I change, I may be abandoned. These fears often begin in childhood. A child expresses individuality. Perhaps they develop different interests, different beliefs, different goals, different values. The family reacts negatively. The child notices. The nervous system notices. And slowly a psychological equation forms. Authenticity equals danger. Conformity equals safety. The lesson becomes deeply embedded within the unconscious. Years later, the child becomes an adult, yet the equation remains active. Every important decision triggers anxiety, not because the decision itself is wrong, but because the unconscious still associates individuality with rejection. This creates one of the greatest tragedies of human development. The person abandons themselves before anyone else has the chance. They suppress opinions, suppress desires, suppress dreams, suppress identity, trying desperately to preserve connection, trying desperately to avoid abandonment. Carl Jung believed that many psychological problems originate from this exact conflict, the conflict between the authentic self and the need for acceptance. The conflict between truth and belonging, the conflict between growth and safety. Most people attempt to avoid this conflict. They choose safety, they choose conformity, they choose approval. And while this decision may reduce anxiety temporarily, it creates a different form of suffering, the suffering of self-betrayal. Because every time a person abandons their truth, something inside them weakens. Every time they silence themselves, authenticity weakens. Every time they choose acceptance over integrity, the distance between the persona and the self grows larger. Eventually, the individual begins feeling lost, empty, disconnected, not because something is missing, but because they have become strangers to themselves. Jung saw this repeatedly. People who appeared successful, accepted, respected, yet internally fragmented, internally exhausted, internally unhappy. The outer life looked impressive. The inner life felt hollow. Why? Because the self had been sacrificed, the authentic person buried beneath expectations. This is precisely what toxic family systems often encourage, not intentionally in every case, but functionally. The family rewards compliance, punishes individuality, rewards predictability, punishes independence, rewards obedience, punishes authenticity. And over time, fear becomes the mechanism maintaining control. Not fear of physical harm, fear of emotional abandonment, fear of losing connection, fear of disappointing people, fear of becoming an outsider. These fears are powerful because human beings are social creatures. Belonging matters, connection matters, love matters. The unconscious knows this, which is why the threat of abandonment feels so overwhelming. Yet Jung believed something remarkable. He believed that psychological maturity requires facing this fear, not avoiding it, not negotiating with it, facing it. Because individuation inevitably creates tension. You cannot become yourself without disappointing someone. You cannot develop independently without challenging expectations. You cannot grow beyond a system while remaining exactly who that system expects you to be. This realization feels frightening, but it is also liberating, because it reveals a truth many people spend their entire lives avoiding. The fear itself is often worse than reality. Most individuals imagine catastrophic consequences, rejection, isolation, abandonment. Yet when they finally begin living authentically, something unexpected happens. Some relationships weaken, others become stronger, some people leave, others appear, some connections disappear, others become more genuine. Life reorganizes itself around reality rather than performance, and reality is healthier than performance, always. Now consider the ultimate goal of toxic control. It is not obedience, it is dependency. The system wants you afraid to leave, afraid to disagree, afraid to change, afraid to become different, because a fearful person is predictable, a fearful person remains manageable, a fearful person sacrifices growth for safety. Jung's entire philosophy challenged this pattern. He believed the purpose of life was not endless conformity, it was individuation, the gradual emergence of the authentic self, the integration of conscious and unconscious aspects of personality, the development of wholeness. Wholeness requires courage, because wholeness demands truth, and truth often threatens unhealthy systems. This is why toxic families frequently react negatively when one member begins healing. The healed individual stops playing old roles, stops accepting false guilt, stops participating in triangulation, stops accepting gaslighting, stops seeking conditional love, stops carrying the family's shadow. The entire system feels disrupted. The individual becomes difficult to control, not because they become hostile, but because they become conscious. And consciousness is dangerous to every form of manipulation. Carl Jung repeatedly emphasized that awareness creates freedom. The unconscious manipulates, the conscious chooses, the unconscious obeys patterns, the conscious creates change, the unconscious fears abandonment, the conscious accepts the risk of authenticity. This is the final dark psychological trick toxic family members use. They teach you to fear becoming yourself. They make belonging feel conditional, love feel conditional, acceptance feel conditional, until you begin believing that authenticity is dangerous. But authenticity is not the danger. The real danger is spending an entire life pretending to be someone you are not. Because eventually a painful question emerges. What if I gain everyone's approval and lose myself in the process? Jung believed this question lies at the heart of human development, and the answer determines the direction of an entire life. Because true freedom begins the moment you realize something profound. The people who genuinely love you may be challenged by your growth. They may not always understand your boundaries. They may not always agree with your choices. But authentic love does not require you to abandon yourself. Only control requires that sacrifice. And once you understand this, the fear of abandonment begins losing its power. Because you finally recognize that becoming yourself is not betrayal. It is the very purpose of your psychological journey, and no relationship is worth the price of losing your own soul.